So John, without further ado, I know you've got a fairly sizable paper for us, so can I hand straight over to you?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. Between catastrophes. The coronavirus pandemic has the nature of a genuine event insofar as its reality is in excess of our attempts fully to account for it as to origins, causes, extent, or implications. Nevertheless, just how epochal an event it will prove is not so certain. For some commentators, it remains simply a temporary interruption, legitimately requiring an extraordinary but temporary response. For others, it's a sign of a much larger and ongoing ecological crisis. Both these groups tend to welcome a current return to greater levels of state action and public cooperation. But for still others, this extraordinary response is not to be regarded as either just provisional or benign, but as an intensification of existing and sinister political economic processes, tending to both surveillance and mutual isolation. This contrast is somewhat echoed in terms of spiritual and religious assessments of our current predicament. For many people, the pandemic is a warning of our disordered human relationship to life on Earth. But for dissenters, the response to it already implies an overvaluing of life as such, which so excessively foregoes risk as to endanger our living of truly worthwhile and meaningful lives, perhaps in preparation for a greater life beyond death. Let us briefly consider these three controverted dimensions of our current global situation. How truly significant is this crisis? Is it the end of neoliberalism or the intensification of tyranny in the name of emergency? And are we now putting life before money, or instead putting a calculus of death limitation before the risky pursuit of a genuinely human existence? First, is it true that nothing will ever be the same again? Or is this just a long drawn out hiatus, as the French philosopher Alain Badiou has argued? In a sense, this is an old-fashioned occurrence. There have been many pandemics throughout human history, and this one is comparatively mild. They are just bolts from the blue, merely metaphorical attacks by banal natural agents lacking in all meaning. COVID-19, or more properly SARS-2, is just the latest in a series of relatively mild modern plagues whose effect is indeed severe, but nonetheless passing. It may intensify certain existing trends towards digitalization and working from home, and increase the abasements endured by those workers who cannot do that. But that's about all on this view. No one seriously saw this coming, and the measures taken against the pandemic are just pragmatic, akin to measures taken in wartime. A political switch to Keynesian tactics, as with Joe Biden, doesn't therefore indicate any permanent alteration, and these tactics have been deployed to defend local capitalism in the face of the suspension of some global linkages. The financial sector has still been prioritized and continues to be so, whether under Trump or under a Biden, and workers have only been assisted to the degree that the market cannot sustain a total collapse in demand beyond a certain level. To a degree, Bruno Latour, another French philosopher, confirms this view by arguing that the COVID-19 crisis is not a dress rehearsal for coming ecological apocalypse. Again, it's too old-fashioned for that, as we can see by the fact that it has reinvigorated the role of the nation state and modes of biopolitical control that Michel Foucault identified as being at work ever since the year 1800. Governments have deliberately sought to play the selectively medical role of extending some lives, while they have economized the worth of other lives, which are seen as sacrificially indispensable to the running of the economy and to the sustaining of human existence in general. What is more, a typically modern duality of culture versus nature has also been reinvoked. We are supposedly in human solidarity against an alien natural force with which we are at war. But the deeper ecological crisis which we face is not like this. It is, first of all, a far more general threat which cannot be handled by national agencies alone. But secondly, in this instance, it is as if human beings are the virus threatening nature, although nature includes themselves. Just for this reason, meeting this more general threat of climate change, species decline, and so forth, requires a questioning of the nature versus culture divide. On this view, then, roughly that of Bruno Latour, the crisis might not change things as much as we think. And it's not all that obviously in a continuum with ecological crisis in general. There are reasons both to heed this double caution and somewhat to qualify it. It can be contradictory for Badiou to say both that no one saw this coming and that this is simply yet another in the series of SARS viruses. Just for the latter reason, although no one could have predicted this pandemic in its precise instance, experts have in fact been warning about the likelihood of pandemics of this kind for years, and governments have been variously preparing for them. And while one can compare the current crisis to the one occasioned by Spanish flu around 1920, vast increased globalization and governmentality means that the level throughout the world of an organized suspension of normal life is without historical precedent. Moreover, recent novel viruses, including this one, cannot merely be seen as acts of God. To the contrary, they usually involve a jumping from wild animals to humans, and this has been made more likely by recent human activity. Not merely a perhaps unavoidable further human penetration into the wild, but a corralling of the wild into more cramped spaces, a reduction of species diversity and of animal development of immunity. Additionally, as Badiou himself notes, globalization renders far more likely the meeting of archaic practices like wet markets with ultra-modern communications. Old dangers are vastly compounded then by new ones. Therefore, as Latour himself stresses, the pandemic cannot without obfuscation be understood in terms of a nature versus culture duality after all. We're not really threatened just by a biological agent. It's only an aberrant agent because its agency is compounded by many levels of human agency, both individual and accidental, whether, for example, traders at Wuhan market or scientists in a Chinese laboratory. And they are both networked and habitual. Various economic links and political systems, besides different human genetic potentials, which have hugely affected the impact of the virus in different places and at different times. Our various human responses will unpredictably affect how long the virus endures and how far it mutates. For this reason, and also because there are likely to be other pandemics in the future, we cannot be sure, even at the merely natural level, whether this crisis is here to stay or not. For the reasons we have outlined, it has indeed both features of a traditional plague and others related to a more recent disordering of human interaction with the natural world. What is more, even if more specifically ecological threats are somewhat different in kind, the current crisis already presents some of the dilemmas that those threats are going to pose far more acutely. How to balance the need for collective action with the sustaining of human freedom, how to achieve at once a pragmatically needed devolution of action and responsibility to local level, as we've seen with the fine rollout of the vaccine in England, and at the same time increase an equally required global coordination and solidarity. What lives are we to protect and what lives are we to put at risk? How do we integrate human dignity with natural equilibrium? How to balance survival with what survival might be for? The second question is how we are to assess the political responses to the great pause in our current lives that here and there is beginning to end, but only here and there. One is naturally inclined to agree with Slavoj Žižek that we should welcome the fact of an increase in human solidarity, even if, or perhaps all the more because, it has to be exercised sacrificially through human isolation. It is indeed good that there proves to be a limit to the human tolerance of economism and utility. The stark exception of Sweden, to begin with, one of the most modern and one of the most secular countries on earth, with households too weak to sustain a retreat inside themselves, is a negative confirmation of this encouraging aspect to the situation. In the end, even the current British Conservatives were obliged to back away from a policy of deliberately slaughtering the old and the sick in order to smoke, if not save, their Brexit bacon. Thus, hardly anyone agrees with Giorgio Agamben's initial semi-conspiratorial view that SARS-2 was just a particularly virulent flu bug, which has occasioned an excessive reaction designed to suspend all normal procedures in the name of a permanent rule by exception. Though nothing like as dangerous as some once thought, it is nonetheless sufficiently dangerous as to justify the emergency measures taken, or at least the majority of those measures, unless one has adopted a callous disregard for human existence. It's estimated that on average, those who died from COVID in Britain lost a further 10 years of their lives, surely worth saving. Nor is it plausible to think that the ruling powers could really have desired a situation which puts both their own wealth and their own power in all sorts of possible peril. On the other hand, the view that the crisis indeed provides for both the state and for capital a convenient suspension of the usual norms is much more plausible. In circumstances of lockdown, the power of the digital giants and of the rising online retailers has been greatly amplified. The same applies to the reinforcement of home working, which by isolating workers from shared solidarity tends to increase their vulnerability and their controllability from a distance. The apparent reversal of Fordism involved here shouldn't disguise from us the way in which this can operate as a covert proletarianization of the professional and lower managerial classes, actually including university academics, submitting them more and more to routinized procedure and remote bureaucratic control. At the same time, the leverage of outdoor workers isn't necessarily going to be increased by all this. In fact, quite the reverse. Given the spur of much increased unemployment and the militarized disaggregation and de-unionization also of these workers, the very opposite has probably already ensued. What is more, despite arguments about the relative virtues of suppression versus herd immunity and of balancing immediately threatened lives versus sustaining the economy, in the end, all governments have tended to adopt a mixing of these strategies and to attempt some sort of balance. If we wanted instead to mitigate these difficult choices, to avoid such dilemmas, we'd have to switch to a totally different political and economic order. We would at least require the degree of social trust and of central with local coordination that has allowed democratic and largely Christian South Korea to adopt a policy of wholesale track and tracing, together with selective isolation, in order quickly to contain the virus altogether. To a lesser degree, more notably subsidiarist and federalist Germany achieved this far better than did the United Kingdom, even if later it's fallen behind over vaccination due to the EU's overestimation of its pan-state apparatus. However, virtuously, this was prompted by a desire to prevent unseemly competition between European nations. And as I've already mentioned, it's very significant that the big British success story, which has rather concealed earlier failures, has been very much down to an interaction between governments, universities, private enterprise, and an awful lot of voluntary work on the ground. So in fact, there's been a huge subsidiarist dimension to the more successful part of what has happened in this country. More fundamentally, we'd have to revisit the entire question of what work is for and how the goals of personally fulfilling and socially beneficial work might require different balances of working alone and working together in direct physical proximity. We would have to consider how comprehensively to minimize outdoor dangers, to compensate for them, and to provide a real and generous bedrock of security for those threatened with a more precarious existence, including that of unemployment. Indeed, we would try to remove that precariousness and insecurity altogether by fully recognizing the equal social importance and difficulty of more basic social tasks like building, transporting, serving, and caring. We would come to see that these are arts also, and we would seek to render them more so. Against these criteria, one has to conclude, after all, that the crisis will probably change little, except, unfortunately, to intensify existing negative tendencies of the kind I've already alluded to. Behind the current tension on the secular left, if anybody cares about that any longer, as to whether we should welcome the new wartime solidarity engendered by the crisis, or rather bewail the inhibition of liberty that it brings in its wake, one can detect far older disagreements as to whether we are to think of the more alien face of the modern and the negatively dialectical aspect of Enlightenment in terms of primarily the Marxist alienation of labor on the one hand, as with Badiou and Zizek, or of Weberian bureaucratic control on the other, variously and sometimes alternatively seen as Heideggerian technocracy, as with Derrida, Nancy, and Bernard Stiegler, or as Foucauldian biopolitics, Agamben, and to a degree, Latour. Is, in other words, capital the alienated human master agent which only the true agency of labor can overthrow? Or is it rather the case that the problem is the very fantasizing in practice of a single agency of control termed the state, which attempts to suppress the inherent multiplicity of agency through systems of complex instrumentalization, surveillance, and intrusion into existential and vital levels of human reality? On this latter account, what we need to liberate is not really unified human labor, as it is the non-alienated human subjectivity as such. Not to liberate unified human labor as the non-alienated human subjectivity, but rather to liberate a multiplicity of interacting agencies, both human and otherwise. Either human beings, for this view, should suspend operation They should deactivate reality and recover a mythical Edenic animality, as for Agamben, or else engage in a democratic constitutional negotiation with all other natural agents, as for Bruno Latour. Depending on one's preference, either for the Marxist legacy or for the Weberian left legacy, one may see either promise or alternatively menace in the current crisis, one could argue. Yet one could also argue that it's possible to synthesize these two perspectives on the negative aspect of the modern. On the one hand, Labour is alienated in part because, as John Ruskin saw, materialism as such is unable to envisage a noble and spiritual end for work. On the other hand, the state does not just pursue power for its own sake, it also pursues an alienated power, only defined as control because of the loss of a shared spiritual horizon. Within this perspective, one can then try more to integrate the Weberian view within a qualified version of the Marxist one. Just as capitalism needs to render naturally available goods scarce and to invent new goods in short supply, if it is to sustain competition and profitability, so likewise our entire politics tends to economize both life and other natural realities by rendering them selectively rare and more precarious, and by offering relatively exclusive remedies and solutions, that dominant word, subject at once to market forces and to bureaucratic regulation. In either case, power is increased to the same measure as profit, just as capitalist profit is inseparable from the exercise of political power. What is sought in either case is the empty and narcissistic libido dominandi, as diagnosed by Saint Augustine, the desire or the will to dominate. This is the very aim of liberalism, in the precise sense of a philosophy predicated on the primacy of the individual will. Ultimately, it is the failure of secular thought to isolate the shared framework of liberalism as the real problem that leads to the oscillation between alternatively money or power as being the arch villain of modernity. Or else it is admitted openly that critique does not break with the liberal framework. Thus, for example, inverting a phrase of Viktor Orban, Zizek roundly declares that communists are liberals with a diploma. What this ultimately means for him is that the subject in her open freedom is dialectically identical with the open randomness of matter. Obviously, this provides us, as Nietzsche saw, with no metaphysical grounds upon which to question the operation of pure power, nor of alienated labor, nor of a seduction by illusory spectacle, nor yet of an ecological domination of human beings by human beings over nature, since this domination is, on this account, itself the most natural thing of all. The equally metacritical and metaphysical task would rather be to discover not a dialectical identity between the subject and nature, the human subject and nature, but a creative tension between them, rooted in their shared participation in a transcendent order, upholding the reality both of the spirit and of objectively desirable ends of spiritual expression through work upon matter and interaction with other natural and spiritual agencies. This brings me to the third tension between those like Zizek who celebrate our current concern with life as such, and those who in various degrees like Agamben warn of our now being reduced to bare life, which will eventually prove to be no sort of rich life whatsoever. Interestingly, this debate has its ecclesiastical and theological equivalent. Overwhelmingly, religious leaders have sanctified the new priority for the medical. But others, and most extremely Rusty Rayno, writing in First Things, have suggested that this is but an ultimate secular encouragement to see any old life as more important than a fulfilled spiritual existence. Thus, they have argued against the shutting of churches and against the ending of public worship. Well, once again, both sides have a point. It is surely hysterical to claim that measures adopted in the face of war or plague are really intended in all perpetuity. This would be to ignore some of the ways in which the medieval church responded to plague, for example. Because we are embodied creatures, mere living is indeed the basis of more exalted modes of living. On the other hand, we know very well that wartime emergency measures often do persist long beyond wartime, even if sometimes for good as well as for ill. It's also worryingly evident that churches have often, especially in the United Kingdom, and now even more extremely in the Republic of Ireland, been closed to an unnecessary degree, and that they, along with other less utilitarian and more convivial public spaces like libraries, clubs, and pubs, are often destined to be the last things to be reopened, precisely because they're less about bare living and bare economic surviving. In the longer term, just as we can see how the pandemic bodes to increase human isolation and lack of real physical contact, thereby favoring a huge increase of the practice of divide and rule. So also we can see how it bodes to increase an over-obsession with the avoidance of danger and an endless and self-internalized quantification of risk from minute to minute, as now so much enabled by digital devices, where we check the number of paces we've taken uphill every day, and so forth. In the case of motion and transport, of walking, climbing, cycling, and sailing, as also with human, including sexual interactions, it's obvious that we do as individuals regard certain risks as constantly worth running, or indeed as worth staying at home for. We tend to become more inhibited by them when we look at averages and are provided with solutions for their avoidance and minimization. But all these things are provided through an impersonal aggregation of our lives by the state and by the market. It is when we are persuaded to regard ourselves as objects through the gaze of the public spectacle that we cease to live with ourselves as self-posited subjects, able spontaneously to sense which risks might be undergone and which avoided. All, of course, according to inborn or acquired habitual temperament, which is also part of who we are. The reverse side of this alienation from natural risk is the implicit taking on of a massive and generalized risk by combined capital and power, which in reality exposes us all to exponentially increased risks of illness, both physical and mental, and ultimately of death all the time. The nuclear and chemical weapons being only the most extreme example of this. So just as pure power, in fact, depends, like capital, upon rendering the natural scarce, so also an apparently sanitized removal of individual risk really depends upon a huge alienation and conglomeration of risk, which consolidates it into one collective peril, exactly like a nuclear bomb. Thus, rule through the inhibition of risk, which the English like to deride as elfin safety, is really ruled through the permanent suspension, in both senses, of a huge axe over all our heads. Thus, we are only, as Agamben's work realizes, reduced to bare life, because this life can ultimately be discarded, like the excluded scapegoat outside the gates of the city. For the logic of valuing life as such, without the risk that a worthwhile life involves, is not that we really value life, but that all life has been economized, subordinated to power and money, even and contradictorily the lives of the powerful and the rich themselves in the end. Liberalism is nihilism and inversion. If only negative freedom matters, only freedom of choice, then this is only the disinhibition of material force, as Locke and Hobbes thought. And so it is identical in the end with death. In this context, one can also note that Zizek is now, after all, at one with Agamben in warning against the global cult of humanitarian aid. The supposed purely human distress of the starving, the ecologically immiserated, of refugees and war victims is really the distress of human beings deprived of that political succor, which, according to Aristotle and Aquinas, is integral to our humanity if we are political animals. This distress is largely produced with their everyday right hands by the very agents of globalized speculative digital capitalism like Bill Gates and George Soros, who with their nocturnal left hands then seek to placate this in a merely ethical, a merely supposedly politically neutral humanitarian fashion. Their real aims are actually to suppress populist and local resistance to their own globalizing regime. In short, I think it's been a huge mistake for the churches to have gone so quiet during this crisis and to have so readily colluded in rendering sacred spaces almost completely invisible. But how might our current situation and the above reflections relate to our wider current and future ecological crisis? Many, including me, noted during the first much more pastoral lockdown last spring, the second more recent one has involved apparently a lot of people pointlessly driving their beamers round in screaming circles. But during the first pastoral lockdown, we noted how nature seems to flourish more without us. Birds sing louder, fish return to canals, deer wander more freely and right into the heart of our towns. Others, however, pointed out how this view of things is to an extent misleading. Red kites, for example, miss their daily roadkill, and many more domesticated animals and plants languish without our tending. It is not actually ecological to think in terms of humans over against a single unified natural world carrying on without us. No, we are, as human beings, one of many sets of natural agents, and as natural, we have a good, perhaps even a biblical and superintending natural role to play. The point is not the liberal alternative of either dominating or liberating nature, but the communitarian one of getting the right balance between different natural actors and between an open human subjectivity and relatively more fixed natural agencies or characters. I think I'm giving a slightly sort of communitarian gloss to Latour's ideas here. They need our free and adaptable nurture. We need their stimulus and content if we are to fulfill ourselves. A good relationship to nature requires us to get into more immediate personal and non-virtual contact with our local environments, which need to be more self-governing and self-sufficient in both ecological and political terms. A good ecology depends upon what Catholic social teaching refers to as subsidiarity. Otherwise, we require a kind of sinister global domination that will be ecologically more precarious. All the same, we can't ignore our essential humanly specific and planetary unity, which requires far better international coordination if we are to survive, let alone flourish. This should not be and is unlikely to be some sort of literal world government directed by personal rulers. On the other hand, global coordination is required, and this cannot be just impersonal or a matter of fixed rules and procedures if it is properly to work. There seems to be something here in terms of shared sovereignty and mutual international self-government that is still to be invented. Although the European Union, for all its imperfections and its increased capture by neoliberalism that could destroy it, had already gone part of the way in this direction. But for certain, such a development requires an emergent sense of a global shared metaphysical culture, a sense of a shared global sacrality beyond secular liberalism that can alone secure the place of spirit and so the dignity of human labor and of all other natural agencies within our local and our shared common global home. Thank you.